Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to this edition of Daksha Dialogues, organized in collaboration with the Indian National Association of Legal Professionals. I'm Anand Padmanabhan, Dean at Daksha Fellowship, and it's my delight to invite you all to this discussion on emerging technologies and policy transitions. This is a highly relevant topic for all law students and legal professionals, what with the explosion of both technological advances and policy interventions, leading to several new and exciting challenges for lawyers and policy professionals and fresh career opportunities in think tanks, multinational corporations, Indian unicorns, and law and policy consulting organizations. To provide insights on what really is going on in the world of technology and its interaction with the policy making settings in this country, we have with us a very distinguished speaker. Mr. Anirudh Rastogi is the managing partner at Ikigai Law, an award-winning law and policy firm specializing in representing technology businesses. An alum of Harvard Law School, Anirudh was named Achiever of the Year 2017 by Business World magazine, and Economic Times has named him as a pioneer for his contribution to the drones ecosystem in India. He is also a visiting faculty at IIM Indore and NLU Delhi, and we hope to soon have him over at the Daksha Fellowship as well. Before we begin the session, I would like to remind you that all participants in this session are on mute, but you can post your questions and queries in the Q&A tab, and we'll take them up at the end of the session. Finally, a word of appreciation to Live Law for partnering with us for this conversation. So Anirudh, great to see you here. And before we begin our conversation, I would like to mention something that I'm sure will make you feel happy as a teacher, which is that the Indian National Association of Legal Professionals had organized a student consultation when the Personal Data Protection Bill, the 2019 version came out. This is really to promote capacity building in law schools across the country and to, of course, reward the more meritorious applications. So there were about 40 recommendations or policy briefs that came along their way. And finally, I shortlisted, the 5 best out of the, 40 that had come for evaluation. So we have the winners here, the top 5, essays who have written excellent policy briefs, I must say, on multiple dimensions. In fact, when I read all 5 of them together, I felt I know much more about the bill than I knew before. So let me just take a few minutes, Anirudh, to introduce them one by one. And guys, they are part of the panel here right now. And just switch on your video so that everyone here can see you and acknowledge you for your contribution. So let me begin with Viraj Anand of the National Law School of India, University, Bangalore. Hi, Viraj. Great show there.
Hello, sir. Thank you.
Next up is Harshita Malik of the Amity Law School, Delhi.
Thank you, sir.
Then we have Raghav Sengupta of Jindal Global Law School. Hi. We have Vipra Sankla of Gujarat National Law University. And finally, we have Mr. Kabir Kumar from Amity Law School, Noida.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you all. I mean, all of you have written such wonderful policy briefs, and we learned a lot going through them. And keep up the good work, and hope that you continue being engaged with both INALP and Daksha Fellowship in the range of activities that we are doing. Thank you. Anirudh, the Personal Data Protection Bill really speaks to the fact that when we speak about emerging technologies, the most important component today is data, right? And data allows you to innovate. Data, of course, allows you to monetize, and data allows you to personalize goods and services that are on offer. So just to start this conversation, what have you really seen by way of the Personal Data Protection Bill leading to this multiplier effect or virtuous cycle when it comes to policy transitions that we are speaking about here?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Anant. And firstly, thanks for having me here. And many congratulations to all the participants. In fact, I see some familiar faces there as well. So good to see, and many congrats. Anant, I think of the Personal Data Protection Bill and also the most recent, the report on non-personal data. And I think many other themes that we might touch upon today, I would say that there are certain common themes, and it would be interesting to look at, identify these common themes across, across different policy developments. Of course, very much, PDP is pretty much at the center of all policy discussions and debate. It is, of course, a very, very important development. But if we look at identifying some of these broad themes, it would help us contextualize this discussion a lot more. And I think in terms of what I would really like to focus is what is the common kind of regulatory approach, that is very apparent in whether the PDP, the way that the policy approach to the Personal Data Protection Bill, to non-personal data, whether it is the Chinese app ban or many other themes such as cryptocurrencies and blockchain and drones, which I think are of common interest to you and I, and so we can talk about those as well. There are two broad themes that I would like to speak about, and I think that's in the question that you asked about policy transitions. These themes have a very, very important role to play, because for any policy professional today, I think these themes will pretty much dictate, your role, your contribution, etc., and the impact that you can have. Now, theme number one, I think, is that the state, I think these are very unique. These themes are unique to the government of the day as well, right? So one is that the government has a very an India first approach to policy making, and I will break it down into two aspects, right? One is from a national security standpoint, where tech has almost become a geopolitical issue more than anything else. And that shows in the discussions around PDP, NPD, the app ban, drones, blockchain, telecom, and why it is what is interesting about it is, while of course nobody can claim that national security is not important or one of the most important considerations in any. I mean, if there is an implication of national security, then it definitely becomes one of the most important considerations. But it cannot be the only perspective with which you evaluate tech policy. In fact, the tech voice is missing, the innovation voice is missing. It seems like a lot of this discussion is being led by a national security perspective alone, and that is problematic. Because in the name of national security, you can pretty much build any indefensible argument, right? And that's challenging. So that is one. The second is that there is the second aspect to an India first approach is the approach where local industry, local stakeholders, and very recently I think the government has a liking for the startup ecosystem, which has become this core messaging for the government for driving a lot of these policy decisions. And while again, like national security, in principle, on paper, in theory, these sound critical, important. The challenge is that if you're making policy for the startups, you've got to involve the startups in that policy making, right? You have to collect evidence on the harm on startups or the impact on startups, positive or negative, of your policy, and that I don't see happening. So very interesting case in point of non-personal data. One of the key objectives, allegedly, for driving non-personal data policy is that it will benefit startups. But if you were to ask the startups, I have not come across very many, or actually, rather, I can probably count on my fingers, anybody from the community who would claim that this policy makes any sense at all, right? And while it might benefit certain startups in the shorter run, I don't think there's any consensus that this is going to be beneficial. It is definitely going to have wide-ranging implications. One on investor confidence to start with. So I don't think the startup community backs this policy either, right? So that is the India first stance, which is theme number one that I wanted to talk about. And unless you have any comments on this, I wanted to kind of just talk about theme number two, which somewhat, I think, somewhat is kind of connected to this, which is that the government of the day is a bold government, right? It is willing to experiment in a way that we have never seen before when it comes to policy making. It is willing to, it doesn't want to toe the line of, say, a regulator elsewhere. And in fact, it has little respect for a regulatory approach, in fact, which has probably been tried out elsewhere. Now, the good part about it is that, well, I mean, again, on theory, I can't disagree with that, right? It is important that your policy making is contextual to the needs of the country, to the aspirations of the country and its kind of domestic stakeholders. But the challenge is that when you aspire to create an entirely new framework, which has no precedent whatsoever, you have not seen it succeed anywhere. You've definitely not seen it fail. I mean, you don't know how it plays out. The only way in which you can and you should imagine, something like this from scratch is by adopting a consultative process, wherein you have involved a wider stakeholder. The stakeholders that you claim you want to benefit should have a say in that policy making. And second, it should be evidence backed, right? So first, I'll give you examples of where the government has tried to conduct bold experiments, the sort that we've not seen, and then talk about how we have not followed these two principles that I speak about, whether it's consultations, whether it is evidence. A classic case in point, of course, I mean, so data localization that is not, I mean, while of course it doesn't have too much backing in terms of precedence, but there are other countries that are speaking about it. Not exactly the kind of countries that we want to be, seen kind of aligned with in terms of our overall perspective to tech policy, but nevertheless. However, then there are policies like, where, say, in the drones ecosystem, we've seen one of the most ambitious unprecedented experiments of Digital Sky, where you essentially say, instead of, I'm going to have a technological platform to grant license, and for the first time ever, I'm not going to give license to a human being. I mean, of course, there's an applicant, but the license is giving directly to a machine, which will not even take off, which will refuse to take off unless that electronic permission is accorded to it. Now, it gives you unprecedented control and enforcement over drone activity, which is phenomenal. But what has happened is, for the last 2 years since we had this policy, you have not been able to build out the technology. You've not been able to. You're struggling with a technical with standards that can possibly scale and operate securely, safely, across the country. And we still don't have any visibility on how that's going to play out, right? That's example number one. Non-personal data by itself, I think, is, apart from few murmurs in certain countries, you've not seen, a mechanism like this being spoken about in so much detail. And it's prescriptive, right? It is not only flagging the issue, it is prescribing a certain solution, and which can be dangerous. Now, in all of these experiments, what clearly defines these experiments is the lack of consultation and the lack of evidence as to the need. If you're claiming to create something for startups, have you asked them? In fact, very recently, what we saw in the Supreme Court in the cryptocurrency verdict, where your ban on cryptocurrencies was struck down not on any other reason. I mean, in fact, the Supreme Court evaluated a number of arguments raised by the industry, struck down each of them systematically, but put down the ban only on one ground, which is that where is the evidence? Where have you shown that there is a harm being committed by the use of cryptocurrencies, right? So I think you're seeing that pushback from the courts, you're seeing that pushback from the industry, but you have disregarded for some reason. In personal data protection, the entire year-long process that you saw, very impressive kind of round of consultation, and you have this entire committee, and you actually, very rare to see that you have a committee, you have a regulatory roadshow of sorts, where you have the committee travel from city to city to kind of engage with the wider stakeholders. And then you disregarded those comments. You did not publish any, make those comments public at all. NPD was completely opaque, right? In fact, much of the industry was taken by surprise. Well, it shouldn't have been taken by surprise. I think there was clearly something wrong with that as well. But the fact of the matter is, like, the government didn't do anything to essentially have the industry participate. So I think these are the two themes which kind of today dictate much of policy making, tech policy making in the country, which is making the job of a policy professional very important and very difficult at the same time. And I think these themes probably give us a segue into a lot, kind of, maybe a deeper conversation around a lot of other problems that are plaguing the industry.
Absolutely, and I think there are a lot of points there that you have mentioned, right? And there have been quite a few pieces to everything that you said right now. So I'd like to pick on this first piece of national security, right? And this is a very critical piece. There is no denying it. In fact, very recently, the US-EU Privacy Shield got struck down, and one of the reasons was the different, philosophy that both jurisdictions hold on the kind of access to data that law enforcement officials and national security and foreign intelligence should have. And the US has always taken a much more muscular stance, and the EU has always, at least on paper, claimed to have much less powers and many more safeguards for citizens. So in the Indian context, really finally it all boils down to, fine, okay, even if you say national security is important, is it actually leading to heightened national security, right? So, for instance, one of these things that came up during the localization debates was that, oh, we need this for better law enforcement access. But really, are we sort of evaluating whether these measures that you take in the name of national security are actually leading to those outcomes? And there's an evidence question, like you pointed out. So what really is the evidence on that? And the connected point there is, how good are fundamental rights in the middle of all of this, right? Like, when you take a rights-based approach to policy, are we really, heading to a point where policy is really governing everything, and you give some technological answer and so on, but at the end of the day, there are certain core rights, and we would not, as citizens, like those to be compromised. So how do you see that play out?
No, that's a fantastic question, Anant. I think so. You raised a couple of points. Well, firstly, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, see, the trouble with the national security, and that's precisely the point that I was trying to make earlier, right? That the problem with when you have when you're looking at the problem with only one lens, which is that of national security, you clearly are not. There is no incentive to. There's nobody, kind of posing the counter question as to evidence, as to the demands on innovation and technology, and of course, when it comes to fundamental rights, right? So I think that's a challenge, and also the whole issue of proportionality, which I think will increasingly become more and more, and we are already seeing that play out in almost every litigation in the technology sphere, right? The proportionality is probably at the core of all of this litigation. So where when the government were to make the argument of national security being being the kind of core reason for a policy decision, then have you studied the harm on national security? Were there alternative means available, and did you do enough to kind of study and address them? Now, case in point, I think I can give many examples. Case in point, let's take the most recent China app ban case, right? Yeah. You identified 55 bans for apps to be banned first, and then you followed up with a longer list. One of the key argument there was that these apps compromise the personal data of government officials and, say, persons with the armed forces who are using these apps. Now, wouldn't a proportionate response, if that being the central argument, a proportionate response would be to rather dictate the government departments and the armed forces to ensure that their personnel are not using these identified apps, rather than banning the apps all across. So I think proportionality has a major role to play, and it's certainly, and I think that's my response to your point about rights. That ultimately that's the only balance that we can find, right? And similar kind of again situation with but I think, I mean, if you were to consider PDP and NPD cryptos, I think again proportionality was at the core of the overall the was at the core of the entire dispute. So I think it will ultimately boil down to that, because nobody, I mean, you can't it's very difficult to also contest the national security argument beyond the point. I mean, even you're limited in your ability to contest the evidence as well. Right? RTI
Right,
has been
right.
field responses. It is a very, and I think the government has found that magic wand, right? Essentially, that it's becoming it's very convenient to essentially use a national security argument.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned this whole aspect of the inability or the difficulty to contest that evidence, because I think you successfully did that with the drone industry, right? If I remember the first draft and now what we have, of course, you mentioned that there are some practical difficulties and we will come to that very shortly. But the one thing that you acknowledged at the beginning was the fact that this is a state of the art policy, right? And we did not always have a state of the art policy. What we had in 2016 was far from what we then finally got. So how did we really sort of overcome this whole national security challenge in that setting? Is there anything that we can learn from that situation?
A lot, I think so. The drones policy is a classic example of failure in of policy making, and there are a couple of points I would like to make. One is that, yes, I said that it is. I called it an ambitious policy. I called it an unprecedented policy. And at the time, when it was really, I think I still agree. It was definitely a very iconoclastic. It was very kind of. I think I would love to see a policy like that actually getting rolled out in practice. But a good policy ultimately is one that works. So if your industry has literally not taken off, no pun intended, on the back of this policy, what is the point of all of that iconoclasm, right? So that's the problem number one. Now, how did we get there in the first place? You are absolutely right. I think the battle we were fighting from I don't remember now, when 2014, when the de facto ban was put in place, for the next many years until end of 2018, when you finally got this policy, right? So a good 4 years plus, we kept fighting this battle with the DGCA and the ministry and many other stakeholders who were involved. And while there was intention within many quarters of the government to actually roll out a drones policy, for various reasons, least of which was, of course, the investment potential, the tremendous benefits that drones can bring to the wider industry, not just the drones industry. But despite there being visibility around these benefits, I think the Ministry of Home Affairs and partly the Defense was able to successfully hold out on a rollout of a drones policy for reasons of national security, the national security implications largely. I mean, of course, there were safety implications also, which the DGCA was concerned with, but it was national security which was the most prominent kind of concern through and through. Now, even in 2018, after that 4 or 5 year period, right, the only reason we were able to see the policy through was actually this impractical policy framework that we rolled out, because it was so impractical, and it was impractical because it gave so much control to the enforcement control, that was anything short of that, and the MHA and the defense, etc., would not have agreed to it. Right. So the only way we were able to actually see this through was to say, well, let's get something through, even if it. And by the way, honestly speaking, back in the day, nobody thought that it would be so impractical. That it would take 2 years and we would still not see the technology platform. We also thought that, well, while you have a technology platform, you want to roll out a technology platform, it would only be practical and pragmatic for the government to continue granting approvals through a paper-based mechanism while you build out the technology platform, right? I almost think that this is actually a matter which is fit for challenge in the court as well, where, I mean, if you have a clear law which sees the viable, which allows for drone operations, and then you're not able to roll it out because you envisaged a platform that you did not deploy, right? So nobody thought about, that one, it would be so difficult to roll this out, and second, that you would be so impractical and so complacent that you would not, deploy any alternative means to essentially grant permission. But essentially, the point I'm trying to make is that it was still national security which ensured that we have an impractical policy.
Right, right. So it still comes in the way. And coming back to the second theme, right, which is the whole issue of favoring of or a belief that these policies can lead to more domestic innovation, right? Again, have we seen that happen on account of any policy in recent times in any of these emerging technology spaces? Isn't, for instance, if one may to push that point a little further, isn't the world leader, whether it is in drones or 3D printing or augmented reality or virtual reality, a non-Indian company, right? I mean, the Indian unicorns are mostly tech like service, mostly in the tech consumer tech space. Am I right in saying that, or am I missing something?
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. But the moment you raise that point, I think you're actually giving ammunition to the government to say, well, that's exactly the reason why we want to bring out these policies, which start looking at India as being at the center of the tech world, and we want to promote Indian talent and the Indian startup, etc., etc. The challenge is that you've not thought that policy through. So that very kind of aspiration to actually enhance innovation is definitely coming in the way. Case in point being, well, data localization, yet to see it through. But I personally believe, and a lot of stakeholders believe, a lot of startups believe, that it is definitely not going to be pro innovation, right? Likewise, non-personal data. I mean, you claim that, well, it is going to enable this flow of data which is being collected by these large, the tech leaders of the world today who've collected your data over tens of years. If that data were to be made available to the Indian startup, that is going to enhance innovation in the economy. But no, you're taking away the very fundamental incentive for somebody to innovate to begin with. So there are these. I mean, of course, there are two very, very stark, differing, contradictory viewpoints here, and interestingly, both stakeholders use the very same point. I mean, one says that, well, this will enhance innovation, the other says it will not. But I think that is why the importance of evidence, right?
Right.
What's the basis
we have a question here from Abhishek Jain pertaining to the non-personal data debates. Shouldn't data portability or open banking solutions, etc., be done to achieve the objectives mentioned in the non-personal data governance report instead of creating a separate regulator? Any thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I wouldn't want to make the same mistake as I see the government making, which is I don't want to prescribe solutions here. But I definitely see that, one, you can't have an approach which is mandatory in any shape and form. It can be voluntary. A lot of companies, in fact, have resorted to voluntary sharing. Of course, it could be good to see many more. And to that extent, if we can facilitate, means and mechanisms through which, and incentivize private sector to share data, right? So, for example, there's a very interesting proposal, which is that could we consider CSR benefits for companies that are willing to share data? Now, question around that being, how do you monetize? How do you kind of measure value of data, etc., etc. But we will have to find a way to essentially incentivize companies to do so. We can't, we should resist prescribing a mandatory mechanism and prescribing any, I mean, I think that would be my position on that.
Right. So coming back to the whole point of what then does one do in order to promote innovation, right, and draw that right balance? How does one regulate? I mean, let's even take the PDP bill, right? I mean, it's a pretty overarching regulatory architecture that's quite powerful and compelling, even if you forget for a minute the fact that it is getting into areas like non-personal data, or it is foraying into localization. Let's even assume that it just brings in a GDPR kind of structure, right? Is India really ready to impose that kind of regulatory architecture? Or if we were to do what you were mentioning a little while ago, right, a bold government, which is bootstrapping, would a bold government that's bootstrapping, in your view, really have done that or done something else from a regulatory perspective?
Sorry, I didn't quite follow your last point, but it did sound very interesting. So a bootstrapping government would have...
So you had mentioned that this is a very bold government and it's sort of willing to do a lot of take a lot of bold initiatives, right? So would that kind of government, assessing the need for more innovation and so on, have put in place the kind of regulatory architecture that is today reflected in the PDP bill, or would it have been a different kind of regulatory model altogether? And if so, what would that model have been from your experience of working with startups and their needs and so on?
Sure. No, so sure. I mean, there's a question I can answer, and there's a question which I can't, which is the latter part of what would that model look like? I think is a very difficult question to answer, and I hope you'll appreciate my difficulty there. But let me start from question number one, which is a government that is trying to bootstrap. Would it have, had it considered evidence, come to the same conclusion? See, I don't think so. But that again, I mean, I don't see. Here's the thing, right? I mean, I'm saying let's bring evidence to the table. So who am I to say? Well, you would have, you would, or you wouldn't have. Let's consider evidence. Let's hear the industry. I can definitely talk from my concern, my kind of discussions with the industry, and the large part of the industry that I represent, or others who are other stakeholders who may not be aligned with these views. But a large chunk of that does not align with many of the proposals in the current kind of frameworks that are being thought of. Whether you look at the PDP, particularly the non-personal data framework, in the PDP framework, there are a lot of concerns, and of course, we today, unfortunately, aren't even able to articulate these concerns very, very well, because we don't know, because the meat is yet to be fleshed out. The broad principles have been laid out, but there's so much more detailing that also needs to come out and will come out over due course. But we have very few answers into how we are going to roll out, how our business models are going to be, what shape our business models are going to take in the face of some of these proposals. Just to give one example, today we have some very, very, there are very key proposals around use of children's data. Now, any app that in today's world that focuses on children's data, which is whether it's an edtech platform, it is a gaming platform, or whatever it may be, their model is going, the business model is going to be fundamentally, will have to fundamentally change, because in the way you can possibly now if I have to, for example, integrate and take parental consent along with the child's consent, how am I even going to make that possible on my platform from a tech perspective, from a user experience perspective? It is definitely going to disrupt my ability to scale, right, or do this at scale. Now, maybe over a period of time, tech solutions will also arise. Tech. I've always said this, that tech problems will be best solved by tech solutions, and hopefully, people will find technological solutions to come around these problems. But this is one thing that one example where the wider industry is very concerned about, and you can prepare for it if you know exactly what shape it is going to take. Right? You don't know what shape it is going to take, and for many years now. So these are the kind of larger challenges. Non-personal data is a similar issue. I can speak from the experience with the drones industry. I don't think there's one player out there, one blockchain company out there, which will say that, well, they have they are satisfied with any of the moves that are. So if your policy is not satisfactory to one player in the industry, then I mean, who are you making this policy for? I mean, because you're clearly missing out one key stakeholder, one key constituent, right? So that is the challenge. So to answer your question, I think I do believe that no, I don't think a whole government would have come to the same conclusions. I do believe that if you were to present, I don't know what shape it would have taken, and I don't want to assume that, right? I mean, then I'm essentially doing what the government is trying to do. I don't want to make those assumptions. I'm just saying, talk to the industry, talk to other stakeholders, and do a genuine job at that, and collect evidence, and then make policy. Yeah.
Right. There is one question here. There have been said by Raghav Sengupta, there have been several database studies on the viability of non-personal data and anonymization techniques employed by data fiduciaries. Considering some of these studies have shown that it is possible to re-identify individuals using a simple 4-point algorithm, what would be the long-term effects of having such a legislation in India, which does not foresee the risks of re-identification from non-personal data? So basically the question is to do with re-identification risks. I did feel when I read the version of the bill that they are actually quite concerned about re-identification, but any thoughts that you have on this before we?
No, it is definitely a concern, and see, I mean, it is, and of course, while the committee is also expressed, but ultimately, acknowledging that concern alone will not do anything. You've laid out a policy framework, and I don't think there are any kind of easy answers to how do we minimize or address, curtail that risk in light of these kind of proposals. So that's definitely a big challenge. Yes, certainly.
One of these, concerns that comes up whenever you talk data is that it makes it look like this is a very tech-heavy kind of policy space, right? But as experience shows in the past, a lot of these sectors that we are talking about, whether it's cab sharing or even cryptocurrencies for that matter, there is a lot of interplay between traditional regulatory systems and new technologies that are sort of changing the landscape, right? And one of the challenges, in addition to, of course, getting all this fancy technology, is simply solving for that problem. Like the traditional regulatory ecosystem, whether it's the motor vehicles ecosystem, the food safety, standards regulatory ecosystem, or any other ecosystem, and how that works with new technologies that are sort of changing the dynamics and business models, out there. And in that regard, how do you think India has fared? And perhaps, your experiences in the cryptocurrency space could really give us some insight on navigating this problem.
Could you, Anant, also give? I think I've understood your question, but could you give me an example Uber
is a very good example, right? I mean, the fact that you have this cab aggregator service, it's not just a technology problem, right? There is a huge human labor issue. There are multiple other policy dimensions.
Of course. No, that's a very valid point, and of course, you have to take into consideration all these varied perspectives, varied kind of stakeholders who are going to be impacted by any policy change or a technological development like this. So innovation is of course just one lens, right? And I think the point I'm trying to make is not that you look at things only from an innovation lens. I'm saying that, well, don't look at them only from a national security lens. So consider other perspectives. Now, having said that, it's obviously it is challenging, right? So it is. You're right. I mean, Uber is a classic example, and there are many other industries where there's going to be a reordering, the social reordering of sorts, right? Which is going to be precipitated by some of these advancements and the corresponding kind of policy changes. How do you essentially? I think. How do you see it play out? What I would like to just say here is that let's be clear about what is the objective of any regulatory system, right? And I think you and I have spoken a lot about this in the past as well. The objective of a regulator is not only to curtail risk, it is not only to preserve the interests of the incumbents and the existing kind of the existing kind of social order, if that is of concern here as well. But I think it should also be innovation in equal measure, because innovation, to my mind, and I think there are other scholars who, the many other people who've done academic writing on this as well, is that innovation in today's world has. Actually, in any period of time, has the ability also to kind of enhance social welfare in its own way, right? Whether it's from an economic standpoint or otherwise. And so, I think it's important for any regulator to acknowledge that enhancing innovation within their space is also one of the objectives that they have to satisfy, and they have to balance out these various, these various conflicting interests at times. This is exactly the reason why technology policy is very challenging, because there are many conflicting interests. Now, if I were to take the example of drones policy,
I remember at a time when we were doing this course on emerging tech law and policy at NLU Delhi. You also have kind enough to join us for one of these classes. We simulated an entire roundtable on a round table on drones policy. Of course, kind of taking a cue from some of these roundtables that we ourselves were part of, and we had literally 24 participants in the class. Each of them were assigned the role of a particular stakeholder in the whether an industry stakeholder, an industry association, a government agency, a foreign government, or somebody who is impacted, who's an incumbent, who's going to be affected. And we literally had 24 different roles for the 24 students.
Wow.
And
Wow.
you had 24 different viewpoints, therefore, right? And to balance that out, I have I have all the sympathy for the regulator in the middle of this, right? But then it is your job, unfortunately, to take into account these 24 conflicting viewpoints. You cannot choose one viewpoint over all others. So yeah, and innovation there definitely has to have a place in today's world, which is not the case, right? And I think, in fact, you and I, we've gone as far in the past to argue that your statute should provide for that kind of viewpoint, in fact, to be taken into account, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that's where I stand on this.
Very interesting. So, Anirudh, I mean, this has been a very, very fascinating journey, I'm sure, personally for you, right? I mean, the fact that you worked in a traditional corporate setting, and then, from there, gone on to set up your own practice, which is now, become Ikigai Law, and is one of the country's leading, boutique firms working on technology and policy. So, I mean, could you share a little bit about how you started getting into the space, and what made you really, make these transitions in your career to get to where you are today?
No, sure. I mean, I can, Anant, this is a question that I can take the rest of 20 minutes and more to answer, but,
We'll have to do that. I mean, there are a lot of students here who would like to know that.
Well, there are many aspects to the story, but I'll give you a shorter answer to begin with, and if there's more interest, I can go into I can venture into a longer story. But see, we were at a and then very recently, Anant, you chose to also call us a weird beast, if I'm not, if I as Neha was telling me, which I will not disagree with, actually. See, we were at a place a couple of years back where we were increasingly working with the emerging technology ecosystem. We were starting to get involved in some very novel niche technologies or business models, which were, I think, for the time, forget there being interest or amongst lawyers, or forget the lawyers even being involved in these kind of the early conversations. The industry itself was very kind of nascent, and it was early to see where some of these industries themselves would shape up. And I'm giving examples of drones in 2014. I'm talking about blockchain 2015. I'm talking about aerospace again around the same time. And so what was happening is that at the time, the challenges were very existential in nature. These were challenges which were less legal; they were more policy, and these were challenges where, to effectively advise your client, we could not just work with there was no law, to be honest, right? You had to have an open eye or an ear on what are the conversations that are happening today, across various rooms, which are going to give an indication as to what the law will be 5 years hence, right? Because there's no law today, but the law 5 years hence is definitely going to dictate, maybe, and some of the business decisions I'm taking today as well. So we identified the space where if you could essentially build capability to essentially advise clients with intelligence, you're able to collect firstly insights, and then you are able to distill them and help them take business decisions, right? And have a clear strategy for for the various kind of ways in which the policy ecosystem could shape for their industry. And when we first started thought of doing this, we did not have necessarily visibility on how the policy framework, much like our industries had little policy, little clarity on how things will shape up. We did not necessarily have the clarity on how this is going to emerge into what it is today, the weird beast that you call, which is law and policy and strategy all coming together, and you have, you're representing a very large kind of section of clients who are doing cutting edge work and are paying you for it. But back in the day, it was driven by just one mission, which was how can we serve our existing clients who are looking to do innovative work and help them really sail through this and navigate this kind of very ambiguous ecosystem, right? And at that time, it was clearly just a cost to us, right? Because people did not know that there was no market. The market did not know that it needed this service, right? And therefore, when it doesn't know that, it's not going to pay you for it either, right? So at that time, it was driven by that mission. I think we just started doing that. We started investing in that capability more and more. And, at some point then, very early on, Neha also came on board. And then there was this, a larger team that we built. And in due course, it started to emerge as as a practice, which and I think the industry has also come a long way from there, right? So I think increasingly there's an organic demand from the industry, and then there is so I think it's kind of taken that shape it's taken a shape where it's become a dedicated practice which doesn't only which stands on its own feet, right? And kind of so that's there. But also, I mean, I think we've seen in just the last 2-3 years, I think the way the policy ecosystem has kind of the public policy ecosystem has shaped up. There are many more players who are doing this. There were always, I think the nature of public policy advisory 5 years ago was very different. There was a very different kind of policy servicing that people were doing, and there's a very different service that a very, very, very kind of different kinds of services that today professionals are providing.
What are the differences, if you could just quickly?
I mean, I think I wouldn't want to paint this with a broad brush, but I think back in the day, say 10 years ago, corporate India, largely for them, public policy was not exactly a word, right? It was largely government affairs or corporate relations, and you had a very GR kind of approach to things as well. But today it is as much about, it's not only about government relations, it's also about what do you say when you get into the room, right? And it's the strategy around it, the communications around it, and the research that backs it up so that I think I would call it a transition over a 10 to 5 or a 5 year period, a transition from a GR to a more broad-based kind of public policy kind of an approach. Now, I think typically the big tech, the larger kind of global players have had that kind of a focus, in their respective jurisdictions, and therefore that approach also when they come into other countries. But corporate India typically never had that kind of an approach to thinking about policy implications that are going to matter to my. I mean, it was not as structured, and it had a very different color to it. I see that now today you will find a lot of Indian companies also building out teams. Public policy teams, and some larger teams than others. You will sometimes find a distinct role for a GR person and for a public policy person. You will see that, of course, the kind of some Indian companies, in fact, have also been able to use public policy as for sometimes for competitive advantage, where they've been very smart about how they've navigated the ecosystem, or being very early in the game, right? I mean, being very so sometimes what happens is that your typical startup, for example, and I think this the startup space today is actually investing in this sphere. 5 years hence, you would see a startup not really having a 10-year horizon to necessarily to its business, and therefore not necessarily looking at policy implications on its business. But I see many of your second generation entrepreneurs, as I call them, because they've built, scaled, exited their businesses and started the second venture, where they have that aspiration and the confidence now to take a 10-year view of things. And there they start from day one with a public policy team, with a view on what's happening and how they can have a say in these policy in policy making, as they should. As we've been speaking, that policy making has to be inclusive. You have to hear out the important stakeholders. So I think these are fundamental changes that are happening in the industry, and I think any students here and who are interested in public policy and tech public policy, I think their role is only becoming more and more important. More and more opportunities will keep opening up, and I think it's a great time for anybody to be part of this. I keep telling my team, and I used to keep telling them when we were bombarded with the PDP. For example, on this Friday evening, you're working through the night on a Friday evening, trying to parse through the draft. This is so worthwhile in the sense that it's almost as if you were if you were around at the time when the Constitutional Assembly debates were happening, right? Yeah. And something that is going to dictate, like some of our biggest constitutional law issues are going to be around possibly use of data for the next 10 years, and you're part of this at that time, right? I think that's incredible, and that's an incredible opportunity for anybody right now.
Right. No, so the opportunity is, I think, very clear, the way you presented, the way many other panelists who I have had dialogues with in the past characterize it. But one thing that students are constantly sort of grappling with is the amorphousness of this kind of work, right? I mean, like you said a while ago, that this was not legal, but it was policy. So there is something there, right? That this process itself is multiple stakeholders, multiple disciplines, and multiple perspectives and insights that are coming in. So how does one really train, to be better at this? There is a training and skill gap, or skilling question, right? So how did you do that, and how would you suggest, people from the law background can get better at this?
No, sure. I think, very honestly, I would say that the skill set required is not necessarily, divergent. I think there are a lot of demands that are, on a lawyer, which are there on a public policy professional also. And I don't necessarily want to make that distinction. I make that distinction because it makes it easier. That might be a distinction in different in many organizations. Like Ikigai Law, for example, we don't necessarily there are distinct teams, but that also there's a fair bit of fluidity as well. So, but for the sake of convenience, I think I would like to say that the role of a public policy lawyer or a sort of public policy professional today, and you don't have to necessarily be a lawyer to be a public policy professional, right? You can be from an economics background, you could be from a tech background, and we're seeing more and more of that, and as it should be. There are many journalists in the public policy domain, and there's good reason why. There's need for multiple perspectives in public policy, and therefore you could very well be from any background. But as a lawyer, you are primarily trained to communicate. Well, actually, I wouldn't go that far, but you're expected to be to be a good communicator. And very often, and by communication, I mean there's equal and more emphasis on your ability to write for impact, write for influence, write for the ability to break down complex ideas, because technology sometimes can be complex, into very, very simple constituents. But increasingly also, the role is becoming harder and harder now, right? Over the years, where if 2 years ago, you had your biggest challenge was just data and PDP. Today it is PDP, it is non-personal, and it is also 5 other things that are happening. The pace at which technology will continue to evolve, of course, we all know, but the pace at which policy making and policy is hitting you hard in this country and globally is unprecedented, right? And for that reason, your ability to kind of jump from issue to issue and absorb so much information, and I mean, our teams, for example, of course, during COVID it's reduced, but you're constantly you are in attending webinars, you're attending events, you have your ear on you have an ear for all these conversations that are going around. You're speaking at so many panels, etc., and that's all important because you have to go meet and have insightful discussions with more and more people, which is primary to kind of having a holistic understanding of what's going on and what's likely to happen. Your ability to then put two and two together, right? What somebody said yesterday, what did I read in the papers 3 weeks ago, and my overall kind of understanding of the law and policy and industry, and what an insider might have hinted at maybe in a conversation. To put all of that together, make sense of it, and then give some insight to your client that they could make sense of, and take a business call on the basis of which. That is, I mean, that's clearly a hard job and getting harder by the day. So your ability to read a lot, which can only come from a genuine interest, of course, in the industry. You can't otherwise. So I think a genuine interest in technology and policy. And today it's easier to gauge whether you're interested, right? I mean, there's just so much happening. I think keep abreast. I mean, there's just so many webinars that you are doing, Anant, and a great job that Daksha Fellowship is doing right now. So I think just participating in a lot of this is going to give you an intuitive feel for whether you enjoy this or not. I think that's the primary starting point right now. So when we are interviewing people, when we are talking to people who are potential partners for us, who could join us and work with us, very much I mean, we look for interest, we look for passion, we look for evidence of that. And then, of course, your ability to work hard. So very recently, I was having a conversation with somebody who said that, well, I don't think transactional law is for me because I can't put in the kind of a 12-hour day. And I said, well, I think you are missing the point here, because yes, I mean, there are organizations, so within maybe the think tank space, possibly, who could give you that kind of flexibility. But there's just so much happening today that I'm not sure you will necessarily find that comfort, throughout the 12 months, even at a think tank. Right? I mean, there will be phases of tremendous, and when you're in a client-facing role, I mean, these are critical existential issues very often. I mean, absolutely, you have to be on the ball all the time. So yeah, it's increasingly a harder job, but a very important job as well, I think.
Thank you, Anirudh. I mean, I think this is very comprehensive, everything that you mentioned today. We have quite a few more questions, but some of them are students at the fellowship, and we hope that, at a later point during the course of this year or early next year, we have you on board to engage with our students. To continue this conversation, of course, go deeper and into various sectoral, concerns around blockchain, cryptocurrencies, drones, gaming, all these sectors where you guys are doing such fascinating work. Thank you once again for taking this time out from your schedule. And to those of you here, let me also remind you that the Daksha Fellowship final round of admissions is going right now, and our deadline is August 28th. We have a very simple form. It's totally free, and all you need to do is just go in, log in, write a legal essay, SOP, and then of course take the Daksha Fellowship admissions test, and then there is a personal interview. It is a rather simple process, and I urge all of you who are interested in conversations around technology, law, and policy, and gaining expertise in this area, to take a look into our website and download our brochure. Look at the technology, law, and policy pathway in particular. But for those of you who are interested in law and regulation as well as disputes resolution, we again have very, very exciting courses lined up for you. And come August 17th, we begin our pre-term courses, and by September 28th, we begin our orientation. And by October 5th, all the main courses at Daksha shall begin. So thank you all listeners and thank you INALP for partnering with us and LiveLaw for being our media partner. And thank you once again, Anirudh, for taking your time out and hope to continue these conversations.
Absolutely pleasure. I enjoyed it, Anand. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thanks.